Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are joined by Tom Templeton, who's been on the podcast before, obviously speaking about sprint performance, but he is the head of our performance program in relation to our strength and conditioning, and obviously he does a number of things offsite as well, including sprint assessments and running, and he's foraying currently actually into some more personal track coaching.
Yep.
And we thought it would be a really good opportunity to get him on and actually start to pick his brain about some areas that he's been exploring and some general concepts in strength and conditioning, because we spoke about it just before coming on, but that the landscape seems to be changing, and that I think is a really good development, but it's a bit of a change from where the world of, say, strength coaching was. Have you noticed something along those lines sort of starting to happen as well in what you're seeing, Tom?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on, guys, again. It's been I think about a year.
Has it been a year?
I think a year since we first did it at the old clinic.
Yeah, interesting.
January, so a bit over. But no, I think a lot has changed, and I think I've been learning a lot from being in the clinic and working with the S&C. But in terms of the overall themes changing, like I kind of keep in a little bit of a bubble, but I'm kind of drawing things from like little seminars and information. We have chats in here as well. You just have to have your priorities straight. Like, where are we working together in terms of like the consulting work that I do with other athletes that have got their own coach doing a track program? You're building strength. Where are we going? Like, are we all trying to make this person run faster, run longer, recover better?
Yeah, so you think actually, as something I was thinking of, where I live in my own little world, and I don't use social media at all. But it makes you think of, you highlight a good point here of like, do we get carried away with what's going on in, say, social media as an example? Because there's obviously so much out there.
Yeah.
Or do we, it seems like you're alluding to, do we just need to go back to just sticking with basic principles and not get too caught up on the hype that's going on?
You got to build off your principles, and we spoke about it with some of the track work as well. Like, you can put out whatever session you want for a sprinter, but what's the principle underlying 6x60 meter sprints? What recovery, what intensity? Like, are you doing 5x5 in the gym? Are you doing isometrics? Are you doing eccentrics? It's the principle that gets you to
and what that principle is suggesting about how you see the development of, say, physical characteristics.
Well, actually, just to extend on what John asked, and do we actually see any changes or trends in high performance? Whether it's from a lead coach or someone working in a high performance setting with a team, changes in what people focus on, or integration of new types of
I feel like it's happening heaps, and we've seen this evolution. Like, if you go back, even if I speak about track and field in general, right? Initially, it was very much like people went off the Russian sort of system, right? And then it evolved into this very heavy strength training. So like the 90s and probably early 2000s, you hear about some of the coaches that are more prominent online, and they mention, we had all of these guys that were very big, very bulky, lots of upper body mass, very muscular. And then we shifted away from that, and it sort of went with that evolution of like the functional fitness sort of revolution seemed to influence some of that. And then more recently, we've seen velocity-based training was massive. And then people like Alex Natera have really influenced things like isometric training and the different variations on these maximal isometrics. We obviously saw the revolution of, say, Nordics in, injury prevention. And most of these have been driven by kind of either clinicians or practitioners, and then researchers, having a certain slant and trying to influence that. And I think we're coming to the next phase of that, and I think people are starting to popularize this next step to me, which is the integration of transfer. What's transferring from your strength program into the performance, and we saw links of that with people like JB Moran and like the really heavy sled training. He spoke about in the research, like, the idea that really wasn't necessarily sprint training. It was, high level strength training,
like power training.
Yeah. The other thing too, and this is just from my perspective, who I'm obviously less involved in high performance as opposed to you two, there seems to be so much more now with regards to assessment.
Yes.
And part of that is obviously technology is becoming more accessible to people outside of a research setting. But there's obviously, and related to that, you can collect so much more data. Is that something that's pretty evident too? What you were saying?
Absolutely. I think it's going in the right direction with that, as long as you don't do that, analysis or paralysis by analysis. You know what I mean? And using your numbers, your objective numbers, to build a framework around the athlete to achieve your overarching goal. Like, as long as you have that goal clear, and like if you're working with multiple different people, like we're all trying to achieve the same point. Like, obviously, simple one for us to talk about is just track athletes, whether you want them to run a fast 100 or 2 or 4. If that's your goal, you can use your baseline testing to assess, okay, where are this person lacking, where are they really good, and then you can put an intervention in place, whether it is the isometrics or the eccentrics or, power-based stuff.
How do you go about linking what you see in those tests with what you see, say, out when they're running? Like, what are the links?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Because I feel like some people, we spoke about this just before we started the podcast, like, any assessment you do that's away from that activity, as we say, is a proxy. Yeah. And even some of the things you do in the test that you would use on the track, like a flying 20, for instance, is a proxy for what your top speed is in a race.
Absolutely.
It's not the same thing as measuring a 20-meter segment during a race.
No.
Right?
You get some guys who you do 20-meter flying training, you're like, Jesus, guy could
run whatever time.
Yeah, be the champion, and they crumble in the comp. Or people who don't show you.
Yeah. That same performance in that, and
they
so
lift in comp.
What in your mind? How do you kind of link those? Like,
I was actually just going to maybe add to that, because probably a better way to think of it is, where do you start your analysis? Because do you start with, and again, if you're a sprinter, do you start with looking at their performance and then deducing from that, these are things I need to look at, or do you always have a gamut of tests that you're going to do for any type of athlete?
That's a good question.
I enjoy, and this has just been developed like just over years of coaching people and seeing people run. I enjoy watching a runner or an athlete at the track first, and then being like, okay. And I think I've done the strength assessments through the S&C, the running assessments through the S&C with people, and I think they've been a little bit for the first session, just a little bit taken back about how I go about it, because I just want to observe you. Like, come down, okay, we're going to do, a 20-meter acceleration, we're going to do some top speed running, but show me your warm-up. What do you do normally? How do you go about it? Do stretching?
It gives you a lot of information about how people do things.
Yeah.
Not to mention, it actually gives you a lot of objective information of like what's their flexibility, range of movement.
Yeah, and you can sort of like, I like the game of being like, okay, look, I've seen like one side the ankle collapses in the acceleration, but at top speed it sort of holds form, or you see these little clues and you go, okay, well, let's test these now.
Yeah.
Take them into the gym and let's see what the numbers confirm, what your eye's seeing.
I feel like that's the only way you can go. I don't know that you can go the other way, because that's where you end up with this, like, I've tested 150 things. And, that's going to lead to this. It's like, I think you can only go, like, what's not failing, but maybe what's are the areas that you want to enhance, or what are the areas that are limiting them in their performance. I've got to work backwards. And if you have time, I guess, then you can start to look at other things, but it's kind of like searching around in the dark for as many different things rather than going, no, like, the door's there, I've got to go through the door.
For sure. I mean, I've done both, like with the S&C work with the crew here. It's like, sometimes some people can't do the running assessment first, so you do your general battery of tests and be like, okay, look, your soleus is weak, or your straight leg hamstring stuff's no good, or your upper body's no good, or your core, your abs back a week, and then you see it in the track, and then you kind of do the reverse. Like, you can go like back and forth, but I find I just enjoy it more. It's fun for me to be like, okay, let's see how this person's doing. For example, we had one of the clients who was like, I can't get past like 5Ks of running before I get pain, and I had only ever seen her do like running drills in the clinic. And we went down to the running assessment and sort of had a look at it, and legitimately she was like bounding. Like, it was sort of like bang. That was her jogging, like, you're sort of bounding across the track. Yeah. And I'm like, how are you doing that for 5K? It's actually impressive. And then it was a funny thing, because there was a guy, and John may have seen him at Collingwood. He kind of shuffles along, just sort of like really small gait, hardly gets any, like, it's almost walking. And I said to her, like, I want you to do that. She's like, what are you talking about? Shuffle, like shuffle. I'm like, yeah, show me your shuffle. And then she just ran normal. And so we're sort of touching on some other things now, like athletes' perception of what they're actually doing is not exactly what we see more objectively, but that's a fun thing to actually build that. And then you can go, okay, look, you're bounding and let's look at your stiffness properties and not, you might spend forever on the ground because you want to work off the ground,
How do you create, I'll go back to the question I asked, like, how do you create those links between those physical capacities, like a strength or a power, and actually what they do? Like, is that for you a formal process? Like, are you looking at the literature of like, oh, this is linked to this, or are you doing it through a coaching kind of lens? Like, what's
Probably more. I'm definitely more for the coaching lens. Like, I'll refer, and I do bounce back off you guys as well because I know you build off that literature work, but I definitely would reach out to people who are more in depth with literature and just use my coaching eye and be like, okay, I've got these numbers here. Let's see if we can create a change, either whether it's a physical thing or whether it's a technical thing. We've spoken about in the past. If it's a technical change that you can make, like you can create stiffness if the athlete's got the physical properties there and actually allow them to access that through cueing different drills or constraints-based training. And then you can work back on, okay, maybe it's a physical structure that's causing the breakdown.
I actually don't know if we talked about this last time, Tom, but I know John and I have, and we've actually spoken to asked a few of our guests, is that relationship between mechanics of how you move and tissue capacity. Because there obviously seems to be a very strong relationship between the two. But there does seem to be differing opinions about how you approach it. And like you actually just mentioned a few of them there. And that is, do you actually focus on, what's your opinion in terms of actually focusing on changing someone's mechanics through creating certain cues, constraints, versus actually working on tissue capacity deficits and seeing how the system reorganizes and affects their biomechanics when they say go back to running, as an example?
Yeah, I think you can only create what you got. You know what I mean? So I think it's unfair to put these demands on athletes if you're aware of their physical limitations.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to achieve like some crazy positions and stuff like that, and they literally don't have the physical capacity to do that, you're kind of beating your head against the wall and being like, why can't they achieve this? And that's when you've got to build that physical side. And you're all constantly working back and forth.
No, that's actually a good starting point to actually think of, well, you are just banging your head against the wall if you're trying to get them to do something when they don't actually have the tools to do it.
Yeah.
And I think the question you then ask yourself is, are they able to develop it through something that is more related to their task? Like, are you going to go down the route of, for instance, more of like a constraints-based approach? Like in a simple example would be is if you don't think someone has acceleration power in their sprinting, do you want to go down the path of giving them, variations in, say, resisted running, whatever that might be? It might be hills, might be sleds, might be, there's better technology for some of these things now as well. Are you going down that path because you want it to be related to that task? Or are you going to go, no, we need to go and get your squat, lunge, deadlift to this number because at the moment it's really weak, right? And the force output that you create is low. Like, I think you've got to ask that question, and it's an interesting. It doesn't mean you can't do both at the same time as well. Sure. But in the past, and this is what I think the trend is that there has been a shift away from this idea of like just go and spend 2 years getting your squat to 2.5 times body weight, which usually was like, nah, don't even bother trying to do any of that running stuff at this level because you're just weak. So let's go and spend.
And with the pliers as well.
Plyometrics is a big one as well, where people are like, oh, you need to work on all this plyo stuff. And it's like, well, maybe you do, or maybe you need to find tasks that teach you to use your contact time better.
Well, and probably more importantly, you asked this question before, John, of like that transferability, because the reality is you probably need both.
Yes.
But there is a foundation, and like we've talked a bit about this before, like your generalized preparatory to the specific preparatory to sport specific to competition, that there clearly is a bit of a hierarchy and a sequence that needs to be followed to actually see transfer of a squat to having more ability to do a heavy sled as a basic example. Would that be fair?
Yeah, but we definitely 100%. But the thing that, and I think Tom alluded to this, is that you can't expect ultimate performance if you don't have all of the pillars there. And that's where like you want to make sure that, say, for that person's performance, that they have the general features, they have, you know, the more specific features, they have like a lot of the technical and skill features, you know, and maybe they even have some of the psychological traits. You know, obviously we've spoken about the pillars before of technical, tactical, physical, so, you know, mental and psychological. It's like if you don't have all of those features, it's probably not going to happen. So even if someone overly compensates in one, so, and we get this often, you're like, you might have someone who is a physical beast, and you often see it, like, say, in junior sport, you know, the footy team, and there's the tall man-child kid, and he's just dominating everything. But actually, if you think and look at his technical skills, his kicking, and, you know, all that kind of, it may lack. And then in the overall development of that person as an athlete, you're going to miss out. And then they get to 16, 17, 18, and everyone else gets the same size as them. And they're like, oh, that kid won the best in the league, you know, the best and fairest of the league 4 years in a row. And then at under 16 couldn't even make the A team for their club.
It's a good point. I think it's touching on as well that long-term athletic development. You know, and I found that I didn't really I heard it when I was younger, when I was sort of starting to look at coaching and training. It's like that analogy of you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You know, once you squeeze it out, like, you can't do that. And I think you'll see athletes, a classic example is an athlete goes to a new coach and then bang, they have this great performance early on and then just dwindles. And it's like you could probably surmise that they didn't plan long term. It's like, let's just do this, this, and this. I know we can get you faster. And it's great for 1 or 2 years, you know, but then where was your plan? If your plan was to run faster in 1 or 2 years, then you've got your job done.
Can you elaborate on that? Because it seems counterintuitive to say that. You know, you would think that, well, surely if you're improving someone's performance today, that's going to help their performance tomorrow, a year's time, 2 years' time.
I think it's simple. Like, I see it simply in athletics. It's a little bit different when you're talking about like a man-child, like growing up, you know, and
that's hard to control too, because it's like,
of course, you're going to use those physical attributes.
Yeah, it's hard to control too. Is like you can't slow someone's, you know, physical maturity from happening.
Of course,
and you're not going to say
that's an uncontrollable.
Yeah,
you know, you can't control that, so you don't worry about it.
It's always sad, I think, because, you know, it happens in athletics a lot. And being around for a little bit longer now, and you see it in other sports like football and soccer, and you see that child, and everyone's waxing lyrical who has less experience, and you're like, oh, I'm really sorry, but that kid's not going to make it.
Well, I mean, like, with the right guidance and stuff like that, and not relying on the physical capabilities and building technical skills around it and stuff like that, there's a possibility that it can continue
but
on.
The likelihood that they're not.
Well, I'll tell you a classic example, which is for your argument, where I played footy, went to school with Tom Lynch, and played at Richmond, and did all that. But he basically was a reasonable sized junior athlete till about under 15s, under 16s.
And then he went bang.
Skills were incredible. Skills were great. Played in the midfield, and all of a sudden, like a year or two later, he's 6'5", 6'6", you know. And it's like he maintained his skills.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, you got this 6'6" bloke who can play midfield, ruck, full forward, wherever you want.
That's a huge
advantage. The ground, and it's just like, oh, no wonder he played AFL and was quite successful, you know.
Yeah.
So it's the other side of the coin to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's where you need to think about developing those things, knowing that the physical development may come in a, you know, developmental athlete.
Yeah, it's funny because I was always a very average athlete, and then when I was younger, I wasn't that tall, and then I eventually got tall, but I was still really an average athlete.
There's another side to that as well. It's actually a good topic. Like, I had a chat to a guy yesterday. We had a discussion about, like, he's trying to improve his sprint time, and, like, you know, he's probably like a 10.6-7 guy looking to go. He's dropped into 10.5s, but wants to be consistent 10.40, touching on that. And it's like, you got to ask yourself, it's like, and as a coach and an athlete, ask yourself, like, is that the potential? Like, is that all? Are you just like, you can exhaust every avenue, you can go as deep in strength, power training, get the best coaching, but maybe you've just exhausted that and you are a 10.50 sprinter.
And that's something that we've talked about before, and I often wonder if, what does influence your ceiling? And there's obviously genetic factors, but there's clearly a lot of environmental factors. And I also wonder for individuals who may have certain physical attributes at a younger age that allows them to perform really highly, having it be too easy for too long doesn't develop those traits for you to actually tap into how psychology can influence your physiology and therefore physical capacity.
Yeah, for sure. Like that environment stuff is massive, and I think it can be like a game changer between you becoming maybe a national level or a state level athlete to becoming maybe an international representative in any field.
For sure,
yeah. You have those support systems. We in Australia don't seem to do that very well with like a lot of sports. Like, certain sports seem to get it, and other sports just don't get it. I mean, I was like, have you seen this today about the GoFundMe with Sebastian Sultan?
Yeah.
Because the Oceanic Games in Fiji are self-funded. The under-20s are self-funded. And we've got an 18-year-old kid who's
the
won
fastest
our
in the
national
country
title.
at the moment.
Just won nationals,
Literally on GoFundMe trying to get 12 grand
so that he can go to these 2 competitions.
Yeah, wow.
Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Like, honestly, like, I know there's probably systems in place, but it's like, this kid has potential to be like one of our best sprinters ever, and he has to find 12 grand on his own. Well, how is that fostering like the environmental side of athletic performance? And you could probably pick millions of examples. Like, people listening to this could be like, oh, this is a weightlifting thing, or like this is a soccer thing. Like, it could be any
Apply to the following sports.
For sure. We're just in athletics, so and that happened. I saw it today. Couldn't believe it.
You know, going back to a question I'm interested to hear a bit more about that John asked about changes in strength and conditioning. Have there been any innovative or fundamentally new things that you've seen created or explored that have influenced what you do with your coaching?
Hasn't influenced now, but I've spent, like, it's been the end of the athletic season and been time to look at some research and look at some information. I do listen to a lot of Rolf Oman, and like Randy Huntington brought out like with through Altus, like a little seminar that was good, and I enjoy like delving into any type of stuff that sort of gets me thinking and how I can apply things to my athletes, myself, and in the clinic here. I think going down that specificity route and being like, okay, what, like, time to peak velocity? So how quickly can you create the max amount of velocity? So you're putting a time constraint on this is in the gym, any of your gym lifts. How quickly can you create that force, and figuring out how to bring that down? And again, like, I sort of preface this with a lot of people with the sort of strength assessments that we've done is like, we do have like an idea of what these numbers represent, but right now your output in these tests demonstrate what you're capable on the field. Okay, and we create changes in here, and let's see how that creates change on the field. If we don't create changes in the game, then we need to change our approach, or we're going down the pathway that isn't beneficial to your development.
And you see that a lot. You see a lot of athletes who are over-indexed in physical capabilities, but they don't actually know how to use it.
Yep.
And that I think is the interesting part of that strength and conditioning that is changing. It's like there's a lot more language and discussion about the application of transfer exercises. And I think this is where, I don't know if we've spoken about this a lot, but the ideas of what's the Dutch guy who the strength one, the ones who did all the coordination stuff.
Franz.
Franz Bosch. Franz, obviously, his background is actually as an artist, which is quite interesting. But his whole premise is very much around the idea that performance is a coordination task, and therefore you're trying to challenge people's coordinative capabilities. So he uses a lot of tasks that ask you to be able to, in different ways and under different loads, different resistances, different approaches, ask you to carry out that task. And in many ways, what I believe he was searching for, and I haven't asked him this, and he can probably explain it better, but he's trying to search out how do you get the most transfer of those physical skills. And weirdly, I'm very critical because I didn't see him get transfer in sports like track. I went back and had a look, and he had a really abysmal involvement in track and field, and then very quickly disappeared off to consulting roles in
team sports. Rugby specifically, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And actually weirdly had a lot of success there. Well, not weirdly. It seems to me it's really obvious why. And one of the reasons that it was, I think, very successful there is because in that setting, it was the right approach. And the reason it was the right approach is they probably had a lot of the physical strength and power capabilities because rugby is a sport that develops those almost verbatim. You know, young guys are lifting from 12, 13, 14 years of age. They've got those features, but often they probably don't know how to use them. And he's come along with a really clear, well-structured opportunity to teach them how to use it, and then it actually influences their play, right? Which I think is the right approach. What seems to happen if you continue that approach, though, is all of a sudden they lose some of those underlying capabilities and then injury rates go up.
Yeah.
Because those were the foundational features that seemed to influence that. And, you know, that's something, you know, that, for instance, Greg Haff spoke about, like, you know, strength really is the foundation for all performance and injury management. Yeah, and that's obviously a huge ideological bias that he has. But I don't think he's primarily wrong. And he says that because the research that he and Sophia Nymphius and, you know, Shepard have done basically shows that you want to change direction, you want to, you know, jump, you want to land, you better have a really high peak force output. And then once you've got that, then you need to hone it into a particular velocity or a particular direction, or know how to do that with, you know, some sort of like other kinematics going on.
The question I always ask myself is, what actually is coordination though? Because we can obviously, if you be specific, like if someone's for a rugby player, to be coordinated is to be able to pass the ball well, to be able to tackle, to be able to change direction. But can you, you know, is there some type of generalized proxy for coordination? And more importantly, how do you actually improve coordination apart from doing task-specific stuff? Like, is he suggesting things that provide a transfer?
Yeah, some of those things. But I think that, like, that's why you get this argument. It's very big in, you know, we've worked in hockey and soccer. It's very big in those sports. Everything's on the ball, on the ball, on the ball, on the ball. They don't care about strength and conditioning most of the time, right? Because they're such highly skilled sports and the ball moves so quickly that the velocities that it's occurring at, if you don't have skills that are technically proficient at those speeds of the game, then you will get found out no matter how physically gifted you are. And it's a really interesting, I think, representation of the fact that you can never forget that you've got to do it in the most contextually specific way possible.
Yeah.
Right? But that doesn't mean that you don't develop those underlying physical features, because then we see in sports like soccer, you watch the Premier League, you watch Syria, these people are getting injured, and it makes sense in some reasons why they play a lot of games and they're close together. But when you've got players getting paid, you know, £50 million a year and they've got unlimited resources, basically, how the hell are they getting injured? They should be so robust. They should be so ready, but they're not. And to me, that smacks of almost over-emphasizing the on-field stuff and not making sure those foundational features are there.
I think the biggest challenge is, like what you're saying, is that, like, it's easy to get people strong and, you know, apply those, because that's been done for years. I don't think there's really been much change in how to get someone strong. The challenge comes, like you said, like when you start mixing in other components of how do we maintain a certain level of strength and then incorporate the coordination stuff or whatever we need to build around it, because it's something that I've been thinking about as well as like particular strengths for an athlete you can build, and then like they go into the off season, it's like, okay, like we want to maintain it. You know, it's like a step, like taking steps. You're like, okay, we've got to a level, let's maintain it, take another step. And it's that I feel like is more challenging to be like, okay, I need to maintain strength, maintain these physical capacities, but now we need to incorporate. It's almost like there's not enough time in the day, you know, to be able to do this and play that sort of, you know, back and forth.
Well, and I think that goes back to your point before, Tom, of going, well, what are the things you need to work on? Because you can justify working on 1,001 things if you really want to, but ultimately it comes back to what are the key performance indicators
Yep.
and what are going to have the most transfer, because you could potentially justify a lot of things having transfer that
I think that's fundamentally the science is pretty clear. You know, we were talking before about Roger and Oka. You know, like I think fundamentally people understand muscle physiology. They understand exercise prescription. And it's simple stuff generally. Like you can read textbooks and you have a pretty good understanding. And at a basic level, you're saying like people get stronger. It's like you've got to ask someone to create a high level of force output. And if you do that consistently enough and you give enough recovery, then they'll actually just get stronger and they'll build muscle mass and all those kind of things. It's like you're stressing that muscular and neuromuscular system. The thing that fundamentally I think has changed is that people are trying to search for what those KPIs are and how you transfer them. Like, I don't think that was always thought about. I think that is the fundamental change. And it's one of the reasons why we've seen, I think, a couple of the trends we've seen. Like the last two major trends have been velocity-based training and isometrics. And the reason is because our understanding of biomechanics continues to improve, we realize that it's like, okay, if you're not moving at velocities anywhere near what you would be in your activity, then you're probably not getting the transfer. Therefore, even in a strength setting, you need to be thinking about velocity. Same goes with the isometrics. It's like realizing that a lot of these positions are, you know, what people consider like dynamic isometric strength. You know, can you absorb or load in an isometric position under really high levels of velocity or really high levels of force? And that's directly come from our improvement in our biomechanical research. We're seeing that like, oh, they hold this position. Can we actually train that position well enough to be able to then carry that over? So I think it's people have done a really good job of trying to work out like, what are the things we want to amplify and how do we transfer that across? And people are looking for that. I don't know that it necessarily always is as simple as implement that, get this.
It never is.
No. But it's definitely a positive search to try and find what is that link, what is that transfer, what is that KPI that's going to get there.
Actually, a question I've asked myself many a times, is actually I'm interested to get your opinions on it, is when I think about performance, ultimately the thing that you should focus on the most is just the actual sport or task, right? And I guess for a long time, that's what most high performance people did.
Yeah, there was no such thing before as anything other than just playing the sport. Yeah.
But then there's the application of strength and conditioning principles like resistance training, because it allows you to develop or maintain certain physical attributes that you may not be able to maintain, or in fact may lose because of the training. Yeah. So there's a bit of a trade-off where if you're doing too much sport-specific stuff, you lose out on certain traits. I also wonder the same though then too with, obviously you can go too far the other way as well. But as you start to implement other types of training modalities, do certain training modalities have certain side effects that are negative? So the example I give is resistance training. And I don't know, maybe this has actually been explored.
No, we've got a good example. Keep going. Well, but I think we talk about that discussion we had around Sue and the Kaiser to
weight. Yeah.
Keep going.
Sure.
Well, yeah. And
I do have another MMA example though for what you're talking about.
Because the question relates to what we talked about before with coordination. Because I know there has been some people who talk about resistance training can reduce coordination, for instance. And when I think about what's required from resistance training, it's very different to say sprinting, because with sprinting, the complexity of the neuromuscular patterns is, and I think beyond our capacity. But when you think about resistance training, when you're moving heavy weights at a slow velocity, you're kind of trying to get everything to fire at once, which almost goes against what you're actually trying to achieve in most sporting endeavors.
I think this is probably an example, but I think this is the crux of why I feel like at times, and Tom sometimes watches and laughs, but like I've gotten much less specific with my strength training.
Yes, okay.
Because I don't know that it transfers as well as what it probably does. So I try not to get too caught up in thinking I'm making as much change in the gym as what I am, because I don't think it does actually make that change.
Okay.
All that means is like you use the gym for a general approach, and like you build those general structures. It's like I just see it simply as like specificity, like the competition is there, and then you just take these staggers and you eventually get further and further.
I spend more time in that next stage of like, how do I, get them to feel this with the weighted vest or with
So there's like one step away from running rather than going like 4 steps away and doing single leg hops.
I feel like in the
Or even
past,
going further
in the past, I would spend more time down the bottom, be like, oh, I'm developing this, and then thinking that's transferring. It's like my gym program is actually pretty generic, right? And it doesn't get that fancy because I feel like as long as they've got these features, right, then I can use those tasks in between to get them to feel that stuff.
So it's almost like you're applying mechanical stress and you're probably getting their neurological system to overcome doing heavy activities.
But you say you got an example about MMA and that coordination?
What you're talking about, like where you like it used to be like, let's just use MMA examples. So, you'd use just your fighting sports, jiu-jitsu, whatever, and then you'd never focus on conditioning.
Because I've got friends who are Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I've talked to them about resistance training, and they don't really see any value in doing that.
No, I got mates. They're over at ADC's trials now. It's just like it's just 6-7 days a week, and some of the best in the world. It's just 6-7 days a week of jits, but some of the best in the world do 2-a-days, and they do gym and stuff like that. But an old school example was of BJ Penn, for any of the MMA fans out there. He went and trained with the Marinovich brothers, and their philosophy was like, look, you know how to fight, you know how to do, all your skills training. We're just going to get you physically as ready as possibly as we can, and then you're just going to go and fight. I mean, it worked, and that might be. I don't see that as like.
So it did work.
It did work, yeah. Well, I mean, he won. Like I think he was a 2-time. I think he had 2 different belts, 2 different divisions.
The thing that makes me think about though is like the timing and like being.
Of course. Well, I mean, like if you get him at a certain part of his career, you know what I mean. Like could be middle aged and like.
Was he still sparring and things or not?
No, essentially just doing physical capacity work.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So it's the opposite of what you said. Like they went down, get all the physical capacities, get your conditioning right, get you fit enough. You know how to fight. Like so, let's just get you ready and you just go and do your fight. Like it's cool. And they had success, but that's not saying that it works for everyone. But you could you can make that call with certain athletes.
To suggest that it's as simple as saying this is the formula, go ahead and apply this is the mistake.
The example you spoke about, like the changes in coordination, and you can probably speak to this more, Tom, because I think you've looked into it a little bit more. But recently, a series, like a short series, came out about the involvement of a track coach who coached a guy named Xu Bingtian, the 100 meters for China. And he was describing their strength training, and they're very big on utilizing the Kaiser pneumatic equipment.
Yeah.
But he described the idea that because the eccentric velocity that pushes you down at, you actually, before major competitions, he would actually take them off those machines for a couple of weeks because he felt that it actually ruined their timing.
It's just shortening cycle
on the track, and they actually almost needed to slow that down and go back to barbell based training so that they were ready to actually use what they've got.
Yes. Yeah, so there's actually, it was a good example where clearly the physical attributes it develops are very useful, but the neurological patterns actually may have a deficit if in too close proximity to performance.
Yeah, you just and obviously aware of the tools that you're using, you know what I mean? Like obviously using the Kaiser. It's funny because you mentioned that dynamic isometric strength as well, and it's something that Randy and like Rolf talk about, but when they talk about that, and this can directly relate to what you're saying, like people have read like Cal Dietz' Triphasic Training is a book that he put out. He's a strength coach at Minnesota or something, or like does a lot of hockey stuff. But I'm not sure if it's Minnesota, but basically he looks at like the eccentric lowering portion, the isometric, and it's like a reverse triangle, the concentric. And with the Kaiser, like the Kaisers, if you can imagine, like the eccentric is so steep and so quick that it puts so much stress on the athlete's ability to absorb that force in isometric portion. Ideally, you just want to see it go up and down. And when you think about someone cutting, if you like microscope onto that change direction, the foot contacts the ground. If someone's really poor, essentially you'd see them hit it, collapse, take forever. Isometric is then extended, and then they get out of the corner. But someone who has like great dynamic isometric strength or can utilize Kaiser very well, like they hit the ground and bounce straight off. And with the Kaiser work in terms of like the timing, that's what it challenges. It almost challenges it too much. And that's why I think Randy has mentioned in podcasts in the past that he would go back to mass-based stuff because their contact times were too great and timing was too fast because of the tool that he used. Because, like you said, like you're always trying to get the best out of your performance. Like Kaiser obviously works really well, but it's like if that's going to hamper your performance, but allow you to get the physical capacities right.
Well, it's not reflective of the physical laws that you have to work against on the track.
It's almost like, you know, and for an analogy of people in team sports, it's like, say, if you play rugby, if your catch and pass is so quick that your teammate can't read, I'm serious, like it's boom, and they can't read that you're about to pass the ball, then you're in trouble because the timing's out. They need to learn how to pause, give the fake, then pass the ball and allow your timing to hit that.
Yeah, for sure.
You want to touch on anything else, John? Or Tom? Did you want to talk
about? Is there anything, like, I know that you've been reflecting a lot, so I wanted to ask you, because it's something we've had a couple of podcasts like this where we've kind of been working through ideas. Is there anything that's sort of come through? I know you've been reflecting a lot in this off season. Is there any ideas that you kind of been mulling around that you're trying to nut out? That I know you said you had some interesting things that you kind of have been stewing over a little bit.
I think it's just like, for me, I start delving into a few different things and I start seeing these like patterns kind of emerge, and then I'm just trying to absorb as many tools, I suppose you could say, or many outlooks. So then when an individual comes to me and is like, I need to work on this, like I've sort of got a little bit of a preconceived plan to be like, okay, this is how I want to approach this athlete. I mean, just basic stuff, like even long to short work. I said I did some work with Stephenson yesterday at the track, and like he spoke about his time with John Smith and like the work they did, and they did as athletics, sprinting and 1 to 4 training, like long to short approach. And I've known about this for some time, but it was funny to see that approach like translated to like drills, like the way they would do the drills. Like the drill would be slow and correct, but then it'd also be over a longer distance, as opposed to you take a short to long approach for an athlete and be like, okay, like if you can't get it right in the first 10 meters, we're going to keep focusing on the first 10 meters until you get that right. Then we go to 20. Then we go to 30.
Well, I was going to say, do you have a particular bias to how you approach it yourself? Because John and I have spoken about this before, and it seems that a lot of coaches will take the stance of, ultimately, intensity is such a key factor to performance in sprinting and in short sprint setting, I guess 400 too, but there actually seems to be some people who do benefit from that long to short approach. Yeah. What do you actually think is the rationale for that?
No, we spoke about this a bit yesterday.
Well, I got a bias to increasing performance. I honestly couldn't care how we do it.
That's a good way
to
approach
what I mean? It's just like, if this athlete needs this, and it is time consuming and it does take a lot of work, and I'm only just starting this journey on that. And I can understand why coaches would build systems and like, this is how I do it. And then we get the athletes come in, and then if the athlete fits that system, then they'll get better. Unfortunately, if the athlete doesn't, they should probably move on and find something else, or we make little adjustments, but they have their core system.
I think one of the things that you recognize that takes a bit of time is that you're trying to find, we speak about heuristics of like what's going to fit most situations, and then you have to make these little adaptations along the way to that individual. But there's going to be some people who just don't fit that, and there are, Jack, Tom and I spoke about this yesterday of like, why would it be that certain people who go into that system do very well? And part of the reason is if, for instance, they actually have a lot of the features that you want, they're going to actually benefit from just raising their overall, say, conditioning capability. If you look at, and John Smith probably wasn't as much of this, but there's a really famous coach who coached Michael Johnson, a guy named Clyde Hart, and his system was very much like conditioning, lots and lots of conditioning, lots of like, he did do faster work, but a lot of slower running as well, and a lot of building. But if you look at the athletes that did well in that system, they naturally had very high levels of speed, right? He wasn't necessarily taking them on thinking, and he made them a lot faster. It's not to say that he didn't, but they almost came with a certain capability.
They needed that.
And then what they needed was to elevate that conditioning capability. And I think, Tom's point that I think is the most relevant is like, if you're committed to the idea of just getting people to improve their performance, you're not really too caught up in what it takes to get there. And you and I had this discussion a while ago when, we were driving, and I said, like, one of the things that I'm most not surprised with, but, actually quite happy with is I don't coach in a way that has anything to do with how I was coached or how I think that it would benefit me to be coached, which to me, on reflection, makes me feel as though I've adapted to the environment of the athletes that I'm working with.
Yeah, for sure.
Because unfortunately, I feel like too many coaches, their whole approach is like, I'll just apply what I did that worked for me.
Yeah, I think like if you do, like if the people who have that idea, because I see even in myself, I'm starting to coach more people and work at the school, it's like that isn't always a solution. And like if you're truly there to help someone get better or improve performance, you're not going to be like, oh, this worked for me, didn't work for them. They're a crap athlete.
Yeah.
And that's not, you're like, oh, they're actually quite good, but the approach needs to change.
And it was interesting because obviously we spoke about it with Phil Bellinger and with Freak. And I think their research actually really strongly just kind of demonstrates like you're much better off getting into a system that is more suited to your physiology than you are going into a successful system that doesn't suit your physiology.
Sure.
I don't know, did you listen to any of this? So these guys...
Makes perfect sense.
Well, these guys, what they're doing is MRI studies looking at measuring carnosine content as a proxy for the...
muscle typology.
Yeah, muscle typology.
Yeah.
Really good discussions with both Freak van der Kasteel and Philip Bellinger. But they basically kept demonstrating in all the research they're doing that, if you come out, even though you might be like, and the example he gave was this, I think it was a sprint cyclist. And she got her test done, and the coaches had admitted, and she was at international level, that she didn't seem to respond to the sprint training that they were doing, even though she was world class. And then when they actually tested her, she was much more slow twitching and muscle typology.
Yeah.
And one of the coaches wasn't happy about it because he was like, oh, maybe she's not going to make it. But the others were like, well, maybe let's just give her work that's a little bit more on that end of the conditioning spectrum.
Yeah.
And it really worked. Like her performance got better in sprints, even though, she was more on that end.
Yeah, doing more like longer, like less
more of that long
stuff.
to short kind of almost idea. And I think that that's what happens. And I think that often actually, athletes are intelligent. They often know, like, I know what kind of work suits me, so I probably should go to this.
Well, athletes know when they feel good.
Well,
you know what I mean? Athletes know when they feel good. And if you get put in a system and it's like, gee, I'm getting absolutely beaten in the ground.
Well,
and then all of a sudden you don't even need to see anything objective. It's like, I just feel like crap.
How do you navigate that conversation though with athletes? Because I know we've actually spoken this before, John, with some of your athletes who have an expectation or give you feedback about how they're feeling, and you try to, and perhaps what they think is going to be best for them. But that may not always align with necessarily what you think is best for them.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think it comes down to
performances really.
It's getting harder though, because I think that unfortunately the mentality that we have in society, and this is, my rejection of this happiness hypothesis crap, like that you should just always feel good.
Yeah.
And that if you don't feel good, that's a negative, right? And athletes seem to misinterpret this in the performance setting of like, oh, I should turn up to every training session and feel fantastic. It's like, no. You should feel good for the sessions you're meant to feel good for. And then there's sessions where the expectation should be is like, I'm tired.
And that's a great point. Like feel good for the session. You should be feeling good.
Yeah.
Because if you don't achieve, I think that's where it gets missed as well. Because some people go the other end. It's like, you feel like crap for 6 months. And like you've completely missed out on maybe the quality side of things you wanted to go for. But feeling good when you should, that's huge.
Yeah.
And do you actually communicate that to your athletes too? To say,
I try to, but sometimes they don't really listen to that. Like it happened to me recently. I had a conversation with an athlete and I was like, okay, you said you would like to do this. The way that I think we achieve that is we need to put in this block of training. this is how I expect you to feel. Yep. A week in, oh, I feel crap. And it's like, that's exactly what we thought was going to happen.
That's when you get at the recorder and go, conversation from last week.
Yeah. Like that literally is what happened. And I was like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
But that's you have to continually have those conversations, because unfortunately, and I guess it's the slant of the sprint athletes that you generally have, is like often they're going to slant towards being on the lazier side of things. And that's not actually a negative in any way. You know, like they've gotten there and that's kind of their personality, that's kind of their physical capability. So you need to work out, how do I extend that? Because obviously the only way that their body will know that they get better is to stress it. You know, and obviously we've spoken about before of like, you know, they can come through intensity, through volume, through density, whatever it is. But even if you go down the intensity path and you leave a lot of recovery and things, like people know that when you do a lot of highly intense training, for the next couple of days, you feel pretty tired, pretty sore, pretty flat. And if your expectation is that you're not going to feel like that, even though you might not have any training or any significant training in those couple of days, I feel pretty flat. And it's like, what did you expect? Like, we did a really maximal speed, you know, long recovery, high intensity. We really pushed your system to go as fast as it can possibly go. The expectation should be that you should feel pretty tired. Or same with volume of like, I always think it's interesting when you push people on volume side of things who are not used to it. They're like, oh, I'm just generally sore. It's like, yeah, like that's the expectation right now.
I think it's an education thing as well for the athlete to understand, okay, this is how my body responds to this. And if they're willing to take a chance, and I think that's something that you need to, it's not a contract thing, but it's like just like a relationship between a coach and an athlete. It's like, are you willing to take the chance?
Yeah.
You know, because if you go into a relationship, like a coaching relationship, and you think this person's got the answer to everything, like you got to understand everyone's a human, like they are experts or they've spent time studying and whatnot in this field. But, you got to ask the athlete to take a chance. Once they take the chance, if you get the result, and all of a sudden you see just a classic buy-in, and it's like, okay, now they understand this process and we can continue to build.
I think the other thing with that, and John and I talked about this earlier in another podcast recently, is timelines or time frame. Because the reality is to develop, my assumption would be to develop a world-class athlete. Obviously it's hard because you've got to find the right person, but for most people it's going to take time.
Yeah.
And I think there can be often an expectation of, I wanted that to happen yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then that's just like, that's almost touching on more just personal like philosophy, you know what I mean? And being like, well, it's a classic thing of like, enjoying the journey rather than like destination. You can miss a lot of things if you're
trying to rush
where I should be.
Yeah.
You know, actually, a question I've actually wanted to ask both of you recently is, it seems that good athletes have high expectations. They want to go to the Olympics. They want to make an Olympic final. And that's obviously good to have high expectations. But what kind of conversations do you think are important to manage those expectations? Do you think it's really important to keep in mind that goal of, I want to get to the Olympics, it might be next Olympic cycle, the following Olympic cycle? Or do you think it's more of this, what you need to focus on is making, sorry about that, a national final or getting on the podium? Like where do you think someone's focus needs to be?
Yeah.
On the bigger picture or on the, what's achievable in the next 12 months?
I'll cop out and say both. But no, John and I did speak about this as well because it's very interesting because you don't want to create like, I suppose, a psychological limit. You know what I mean? Whether it's a time of a performance or a placing in performance, because I believe that's very much a real thing. That if you, and for some reason, thinking about it now, like I feel like it's much more one way than it is the other. Because if you're a coach and the athlete's bought into your system and you're doing things and you're like, look, I only expect you to come third at nationals. Like, I think they're more likely to come third
or fifth or eighth.
Yeah, rather than win it.
Yeah, well,
you know what I'm saying? Like, it seems to be, the negative seems to be much more powerful than the positive. And like, look, I think you have the potential to win it, but they might come third.
Well, because playing devil's advocate, because I also wonder, can the psychology be of you get to nationals, you don't perform well, and you go, oh, well, it's all right because the big goal is to make the Olympics in 4 years, and it's a timeline far and away enough that you can still protect your ego, so to speak, from that poor performance recently.
Yeah, the idea that I was thinking, and we've spoken about this from a general behavioral point of view, and even just like business, but I like the terminology that gets used by a guy named Gary Vaynerchuk, and he says, like micro speed, macro patience, right? Which I think to me is the most, like, in the moment, you got to be going for it, and you got to be like, I got to get better today. Like every day I turn up, I got to get better. But then you got to know that, like, I improved 1 millimeter today.
You've got to have that.
I need a
But
million.
you improved.
But I need a million of these millimeters to get to that.
I was going to say, you got to have that mindset for 1,000 days, to see the actual macro change.
And it's interesting because I do encourage people to listen to. It was a really interesting discussion with Lex Friedman and Walter Isaacson. He talks about the book that he wrote on Elon Musk. Have either of you listened to that podcast?
No, but I've read his book on Steve Jobs, the biography for that. Yeah.
So it was interesting in talking about Elon Musk. He said he's very much like that. And to the point where it's almost manic. He's calling...
You don't get to where he is without having certain traits.
They're trying to get these rockets for SpaceX off in 2 years' time. Yeah. And he's calling a Sunday 10 o'clock in the evening meeting for everyone, all the staff to be there because we urgently need to fix this button that's not working on the spacecraft. And he's like... He doesn't get the idea that, like, this is happening in 2 years.
I watched a documentary on Elon Musk, and he actually wasn't interviewed, but a lot of other people that worked with him were, including some of the people in SpaceX. And it was interesting, some people talking about their history and recollection working with him. There was a lot of tears in that documentary from some of the people he worked with, just because, similar to Steve Jobs, he had that same reputation of, like, he got every bit out of you. And obviously part of that was also pushing people to the edge, but it also led to a speed of getting to the goal much more quickly.
I don't know if it's Elon that said this, but, like, I think it's true. Is like, you should think about what you want to achieve in 10 years and try and do it in the next 6 months. I don't know who said that. I don't know if it was him or not, but, and it's not, like, the person who said it said, it's not that you will achieve it in the next 6 months. It's just that if you think,
intent.
Yeah, your intent is to try and get it done as quickly as possible. It changes that whole thing. And I feel like that's where it's important to set really clear, tangible things. The thing you've got to be aware of, you ask that question and go all the way back to your question. I think it's very individual because some people are really scared by that big goal as well. Like, for some people, it's much more approachable just to say, my goal is to run as fast as I can, and what I'm going to do is turn up every training session and do the best I can. If you set the Olympics, you set, making the final, you set winning national...
Too daunting.
It can be way too daunting for, and that actually can be paralyzing for them because all they do, and this happens a lot, I've noticed, is what they'll do, and I'm really guilty of this because I'm not scared of putting out very big goals. And even for other people, the athletes, like, you're capable of this. And I'm always on the optimistic side, always. I'm sure there are people I talk to and they're like, he's saying absolute garbage, right? That person's not capable of that. But like Tom was saying, like, I would much rather them believe they're capable of more and be disappointed than the other way around where you're capping them, right? But you've got to be really careful with it because what it sometimes does is they'll have a bad training session and they're not stupid, they're adults. So they go, oh, I'm only here and I'm meant to be here with my flying 20 time. I'm not going to make it. I've got no chance of winning nationals if I'm only running 1.9 and I need to run 1.7 for a flying 20. Like, it's not going to happen. What am I doing? This is a waste of time. Training's not working, blah, blah, blah.
It creates such a negative environment.
So the thing that I've probably leaned towards more is saying you're capable of this, but then you don't bring that up much. You basically just say, like, your job is to turn up and get better every single opportunity you get. Challenge yourself on that level.
With the athletes that you have those discussions with, do they ever ask you, like, how are we going to go about, like, apart from just the training, obviously rocking up and training, but, like, how are we going to create this sort of intent like within our sessions to get there?
Sometimes I think, like, again, it's just very individual. Some people want to know all the details. Some people don't want to know the details. Some people are really interested in the process and they want to be involved in that process and like, oh, I like doing this kind of stuff. Some don't. So it very much like comes down to that individual and working out like what do they want to go through. Like some of them, they literally want you to sit down and be like, this is what we're going to do for this session. You know, like, and you know, like for instance, some of them want to practice. For instance, Sam, she finished 4th at the World Unis, right? And she was actually doing that coming off, an injury. So we didn't have any races. We had to kind of like time trial our way into it. And she, she's an athlete that likes to be kind of very, well planned. And so we worked about like, okay, on more than one occasion, we're actually going to practice what the rounds are going to look like.
Okay.
So you're going to do, when you was on this day of the week, so I was like, we'll even do it on that day of the week.
Same day, same time.
Same time, same day.
Yeah.
It wasn't exactly because one of them was 8 o'clock, so we did it like 6 o'clock or something, but like same time, you're going to turn up the next day, you're going to do this, and then you're going to run this round, and then you're going to do this round. And we did that more than once.
Okay.
Right? So it was like, but for other people, they're like, I don't care.
Yes, it's
I'm ready.
Yeah.
I'm ready. Like, I know I can run fast.
Sure. And I suppose another thing, because I haven't read those books or listened to podcasts, but guys like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, I've listened to some podcasts with them in them, and they're fascinating. But they seem like they're people who are like, can be hyper focused.
Yes.
And I'm not sure, like, when you're dealing with athletes, like, and even probably yourselves, like, that focus, and I don't think it's spoken a lot of, like, can you actually focus on you're doing an A skip and like where, like the athletes, like they're clear on, they're just thinking about where their foot is or what they're in the drill, like, and you see different levels of focus with the athletes.
a million percent. And some, like, unfortunately, I made the big mistake of trying to get people to all be the same with that.
In that, like that. Yeah. Okay.
Some people can't do it. And so you've got to decide, like, is that a limiting factor? Right? Like, some people can't focus on what you're asking them to focus. But the question then becomes, is that limiting their performance? Because if they can focus in the performance, then you need to allow them maybe some more leeway in the training environment because they're smart enough to work out in this context it's important.
Yeah.
Whereas I'd much rather, and I had this conversation with someone the other day, of I would much rather the person who performs in the competition but doesn't train that well, right?
Yeah.
Or doesn't train to the same level versus the person who's like an all-star in training and then in the competition doesn't perform. And even Randy mentioned that with Sue. He's like, he never ran the times in training that he ran in competitions. But I was okay with that because I'd worked out what,
he knew that he was
the gaps were, what those correlations were. If you ran this, it meant this, like, and you see that a lot actually with developing athletes. They never ever run anywhere near the times. And then the challenge I feel like I've had to have, and I think this happens in the gym, with older athletes, they can hit their PBs or they can hit their track performances, but it's coming at a big cost if you are trying to get that in a training environment when they're older, because often that's come through a lot of like adrenaline and the context of the environment. It's like when you're young, you can sometimes hit personal bests quite often because your system's not anywhere near its capability. But if you're 30 plus, for instance, and you're trying to ask that person to run a flying 20 PB that they did 4 years ago, right? It's a very different game. And then that's why you've got to look at like, can I get that with maybe a tailwind or some assistance because I need them to feel that? Or do I need to, make sure I send them to this race that I know has got a tailwind so that they can run that kind of time early in the season, knowing that once they've got that in the system, they're going to be ready for the next steps, rather than being like, I need to see this at training because it makes me confident that they're going well.
Oh, yeah.
Which is such a big challenge of like, as a coach, trying to make sure that your confidence in their capability is not tied to the performances that you see in the training environment. It's very much, I think, obviously it's going to be influenced by it. And if it's really bad, then you need to do something. And if it's really good, I think you need to be really cautious. Generally it should be, and I think we spoke about this, like the track coach, Steve Fudge, he's got those old videos, and it's funny because I feel like he's gone through like 3 or 4 evolutions in the different things that he says. But one of the things he said early on was one of the worst things that can happen is you get too many good sessions all close together. And when I first heard it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And he's saying like, because what that tells me is that they're coming towards a peak performance. And if I haven't planned that to happen, then we're in real trouble because
it's going to be a natural sort of low.
You can't sustain that level.
Yeah. Say for instance, it happens early in the season, and then you're like, oh shit, we're going to have to really back off and come back up. And particularly for the international athletes that are at a high level, it's like there's certain qualification opportunities you need to maximize on, which is one of the things that changes very heavily with developmental athletes versus professional athletes. With developmental athletes, and to me, a developmental athlete really is anyone who hasn't quite reached that top level, even irrespective of age. For them, like if they run a personal best, they don't really care when it is. No. They're just happy that they ran a personal best. Whereas it's almost pointless for you if you're someone who knows you've already even qualified for the Olympics, that you're running a personal best in your first race of the season, and then you've got to go to major competitions, you've got to get through your qualification, like through, say, a selection trials or national championships. Like you could be in a real lot of trouble if you've done it at a time that's not really correct for that sequence.
The probability of you getting a PB, the more experienced you are, is lower. And I guess the other thing is you can't rely on emotional pumps to like achieve a certain physical state, because you're going to have less emotional response.
The same thing goes, I think, for say sporting teams. Like you really, and I don't follow the AFL closely anymore, but like this year, for instance, there seems to have been a bit of a hangover for Brisbane and Collingwood, right? And they were the 2 grand finalists, and they were 2 clearly best teams. But
then Geelong's coming back after.
Yeah, well, they had last year. They didn't do very well, right? But it's interesting because it's like, what will happen with those teams? And potentially what we'll see is their performance will start to gear up towards the finals, right? And I'm expecting that to happen. I don't have any reason to say why. I just think that they're still good teams, and we might see that. And it's like they're kind of getting their timing right.
Yeah, okay.
There's no point coming out in round 0 to 5, 1 to 5, and you win all the games by 100 points, and then by round 16 you run out of gas and you're actually, you only just limp into the finals and lose in the first round.
I suppose a good question would be, for Collingwood and Brisbane coming off a grand final, be like, have they planned that?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like that would be a more interesting thing, because I feel like some people stumble and teams can stumble upon performances and not necessarily know why it's happening. And it would be interesting if they're like, we extended our break.
I was about to say, like, even for the players, they're like, no, we only want you to start in preseason here. And like, that's a bit late. It's like, it's all right. Give yourself a bit of time to recover, you know?
Yeah, and even the back and forth, because like, particularly in a team sport environment, like you could ask Collingwood and Brisbane players round 1, you guys are trying to win, right? And like they'd be going as hard as they possibly can, but that's where the overarching like team management and physical conditioning preparation, people are like, okay, we're allowing them to build, but they might not be. They'll be like, we're trying to win straight off the bat, and then we can observe the natural trends. That's what I would find fascinating, because if they plan for it, it's like borderline
genius.
Yeah. You got to have some confidence to do that.
For sure.
It's like the story. I remember Greg Haff telling the story about Anna Mears, the Australian gold medalist. She's now the chef de mission for the Olympic team. And interestingly, cycling and sprint cycling tends to be a sport where they really do push people pretty hard in terms of volume. And one of the things that they noticed was her training was going really well, and she was coming up, they thought, early before, I think it was the 2008 Olympics. So they pushed her back into more volume of training, more strength training, particularly
like
to dampen her performance. And as you said, like, I think it's a pretty bold thing to do, going like, she's improving.
We might not come back. Well, that's the fear,
Yeah, but they did that, and then she came out, won, I think she broke the world record, smashed everyone, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, it was justified. But it's an interesting thing of like, I think the big one.
But that also requires a lot of maturity
and trust
from the athlete too, to be like, I think I know what you're doing here because I don't feel as good, and I'm not.
No. I
fast
think
as
it would have
well.
been a very open discussion.
Yeah,
But like, I think I've been thinking about this a fair bit in the idea of like, planned overreaching. And I feel like if you're not overreaching in some aspect, then you're in trouble anyway.
Yeah.
We spoke about
Yeah.
developing stress and making sure that you're continuing that conversation. So it's, are you having an open conversation like, yeah, okay, well, where the plan is to push you here, and like, what's your expectation? Because if it's that I'm going to feel great every session, then you're probably,
Well, you're probably not creating the
amount of
change
stress
and the stress that you would like to see.
Yeah. Alrighty. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom.
No worries, guys. Thanks for having me.